The sound of Richard Sterling's laughter echoed through the 60-story glass penthouse, cruel and utterly triumphant. He had just crushed Clara Kensington, stripping her of her shares, her bank accounts, and a decade of her life's work. She walked out of his office with exactly $42 to her name, her posture rigid as the heavy mahogany doors slammed shut behind her. Richard casually poured himself a glass of 50-year-old Scotch, convinced he was a god among men. He had no idea that the quiet click of her heels retreating down the marble hallway was a death knell. Within exactly 14 minutes, his $30 billion empire would completely evaporate. The boardroom of Etheris Holdings smelled of polished leather, ozone from the humming servers' floors below, and unadulterated greed. Rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Manhattan skyline, blurring the city lights into streaks of neon. Clara Kensington stood at the end of the 20-foot oak table. Her dark raincoat was completely soaked, dripping silently onto the imported Persian rug. She looked exhausted, her eyes shadowed with the weight of 70-hour work weeks and the fresh, agonizing sting of betrayal. Across from her sat Richard Sterling. Richard was a man who wore his wealth like a weapon. His bespoke Tom Ford suit was immaculate, his silver hair perfectly coiffed. He was currently leaning back in his chair, swirling an amber liquid in a crystal tumbler, looking at Clara with an expression of amused pity. "Let me understand this, Clara," Richard drawled, his voice smooth and dangerous. "You are demanding 20% of Etheris?" "I am not demanding anything that isn't mine, Richard," Clara replied. Her voice was quiet, but it didn't tremble. "I built the Aegis algorithm. Every single high-frequency trading firm on Wall Street relies on my code. You provided the initial seed money, yes. But I built the engine. We had a verbal agreement, and then a drafted term sheet that you conveniently lost before the IPO. "A verbal agreement," Richard chuckled, glancing at his CFO, Thomas Reynolds, who was hovering nervously near the wet bar. Thomas offered a weak, sycophantic smile. "Clara, please. You are a brilliant engineer, a visionary even. But you are not a businesswoman. The world doesn't run on handshakes and promises made in a garage 6 years ago. It runs on ink. And the ink says Etheris Holdings owns every line of code you've ever typed while breathing on company time. You locked me out of the building," she stated flatly. "You froze the joint corporate accounts. You even had your legal team file an injunction against my personal assets pending an investigation into corporate espionage. You're trying to starve me out." Richard set his glass down. The clink was sharp in the quiet room. "I'm protecting my company. You were getting erratic, demanding board seats, threatening to take your genius elsewhere. I simply secured the perimeter." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "You have nothing, Clara. Your bank accounts are locked. Your credit cards are declined. I hear your landlord is preparing an eviction notice. I hold all the cards." He slid a manila folder across the polished oak. It stopped inches from Clara's wet hands. "This is a severance package," Richard said, his tone dripping with mock generosity. $50,000, enough to get you an apartment in Queens and a fresh start at some mid-level tech firm. In exchange, you sign this NDA, you formally relinquish any and all claims to the Aegis algorithm, and you walk away. If you don't sign it right now, I will bury you in litigation until you are an old woman. You won't even be able to afford a public defender by the time I'm done with you." Clara looked down at the folder. She didn't touch it. She thought about the endless nights she had spent debugging the system, the weekends sacrificed, the personal relationships ruined to build Richard's fortune. She had trusted him. She had believed in his vision of revolutionizing global finance. Instead, he had built a parasitic empire on her back and was now flicking her away like an insect. 50,000, Clara whispered. It's more than fair for a disgruntled employee. Richard smiled. Slowly, Clara raised her head. The exhaustion in her eyes had vanished, replaced by a cold, terrifying clarity. She looked directly into Richard's smug face. You think you own the algorithm, Richard. You think your lawyers covered every loophole. But you only understand the surface of what I built. You don't understand the foundation. Richard burst into laughter. It was a loud, booming sound that bounced off the glass walls. He threw his head back, genuinely amused. Oh, Clara! The dramatic exit, the cryptic threat. What are you going to do? Hack the mainframe. This isn't a movie. We have the top cybersecurity team on the planet. Your credentials were revoked hours ago. You are broke. You are powerless. And you are officially trespassing. He waved a dismissive hand toward the door. Take the 50 grand or get out. I have a dinner reservation at Le Bernardin. Clara didn't blink. She reached into her pocket, bypassed the manila folder entirely, and pulled out her phone. It was an older model, a burner she had bought with cash that morning. Keep the 50,000, Richard, Clara said softly. You are going to need it. She turned on her heel. The heavy mahogany doors parted as she pushed through them, closing with a solid, echoing thud. Richard watched her go, a smirk playing on his lips. He picked up his scotch. Well, he said to Thomas, that went exactly as expected. Cancel her severance offer. Let her starve. Thomas frowned, wiping his brow with a silk handkerchief. Are you sure that was wise, Richard? She built the entire back end. If she left a back door... Don't be a coward, Thomas, Richard snapped. We swept the code 3 times. It's clean. She's just a desperate woman trying to save face. Pour me another drink. We are up 15 points on the NASDAQ today. Let's celebrate. Outside, Clara stepped into the private elevator. The doors slid shut, sealing away the sound of Richard's world. She leaned against the cold steel wall, closing her eyes for a brief second. Her heart was pounding, a frantic bird against her ribs. She was terrified. She was completely broke. But as the elevator began its rapid descent, a slow, dangerous smile crept onto her face. The street-level lobby was a cavern of white marble and indifferent security guards. Clara walked past the front desk, her wet shoes squeaking slightly on the polished floor. She pushed through the revolving doors and stepped out into the biting Manhattan rain. She walked 2 blocks, seeking the chaotic anonymity of Times Square. Neon lights reflected in the puddles, casting jagged, colorful shadows across the pavement. She found a small, grimy coffee shop, ordered a black coffee with her remaining pocket change, and sat at a sticky table in the back. She placed her burner phone on the table. It was exactly 4:15 p.m. What Richard Sterling didn't know, what his army of corporate lawyers and code sweepers had failed to uncover, was a fundamental flaw in their legal ownership. Richard had indeed forced Clara to sign over the intellectual property of the Aegis algorithm to Etheris Holdings. However, the Aegis algorithm relied entirely on a foundational cryptographic library, a tiny, invisible cornerstone of code that handled the proprietary data compression. Clara hadn't written that library at Etheris. She had written it during her time at MIT, 4 years before she even met Richard. She had copyrighted it under a blind trust named the Chrysalis Foundation. When Etheris integrated her code, Clara had silently embedded a dynamic licensing check. Etheris wasn't using the code. They were leasing it from Chrysalis, a lease that Clara, as the sole trustee, could terminate at any moment if the terms were violated. And Richard freezing her assets was a direct violation of the hidden licensing agreement. Clara opened a secure browser on her phone, She bypassed 3 layers of biometric security and entered a string of alphanumeric characters she had memorized years ago. The screen blinked green. A simple prompt appeared. Revoke license globally. Y/N. Goodbye, Richard, Clara whispered. She pressed Y, then she hit enter. 60 floors up, Richard Sterling was admiring his reflection in the window when the first domino fell. It didn't start with an explosion. It started with a subtle electronic chime. Thomas Reynolds's tablet buzzed on the wet bar. Thomas picked it up, expecting an email from his assistant. Instead, his face drained of all color. "Richard," Thomas breathed, his voice trembling. "What is it?" Richard asked without turning around. "Did the mayor finally RSVP to the gala?" "Richard, look at the monitors." Richard turned. The western wall of his office was dominated by a massive, multi-screen command center, displaying global market feeds, Ethereus server statuses, and client data flows. A moment ago, it had been a sea of calming greens and blues. Now, an aggressive, blinking red was spreading across the screens like a digital infection. Server cluster alpha, offline. Server cluster, beta, offline. Client data routing, failed. "What the hell is this?" Richard snapped, setting his drink down so hard the crystal cracked. "Get it on the phone immediately. We're having a localized outage." "It's not localized," Thomas stammered, frantically swiping across his tablet. "London is down. Tokyo is down. Frankfurt just disconnected." The phone on Richard's desk began to ring. It was a dedicated line for their Tier 1 clients, the mega banks. It almost never rang. Before Richard could reach it, a second line lit up. Then a third. Within 10 seconds, all 12 lines on the console were flashing violently. Richard snatched the receiver. "Sterling. Richard. It's David Thorne at Goldman. What the hell is happening to your feed? Our automated trading just froze mid-transaction. We are flying blind here. We've lost connection to the Aegis engine." "Calm down, David," Richard said, forcing an authoritative tone while his eyes darted nervously over the red screens. "It's a minor routing glitch. We're running a patch. It will be back up in—" "I don't care about your patches!" the banker screamed. "We are bleeding millions by the second. Fix it now, or I'm pulling our contracts." The line went dead. "Sir," Thomas choked out, dropping his tablet. "The code, the algorithm, it's gone." "What do you mean, gone? It's sitting on our proprietary servers." "No, sir. The core compiler is rejecting our own servers. It's returning a fatal error. License revoked. Intellectual property violation. It's systematically shutting down the entire infrastructure to prevent unauthorized access." Richard felt the blood drain from his head. A cold, nauseating dread settled in his stomach. License revoked. He had 50 lawyers confirm they owned every scrap of that code. Suddenly, his private office doors burst open. Sarah Jenkins, the lead in-house counsel for Ethereus, ran into the room. Her usual composed demeanor was shattered. She was clutching a stack of freshly printed papers, her hands shaking violently. "Richard," Sarah gasped, struggling to catch her breath. "We have a catastrophic problem." "I am aware we have a server issue, Sarah," Richard roared, losing his temper. "Get out of here and let me handle it." "It's not a server issue," Sarah yelled back, slamming the papers onto his desk. "It's an injunction, filed automatically 5 minutes ago in federal court. Clara Kensington just issued a cease and desist order against Ethereus Holdings. She has no grounds. We own the code." "We own the assembly, Richard. We don't own the foundation." Sarah flipped to the second page, pointing to a highlighted section. "She owns the base cryptographic library under a shell trust. The entire Aegis algorithm is built on top of it. It's like we built a skyscraper on land we didn't buy. She just pulled the lease. Any attempt to restart the servers without her cryptographic key is a federal crime under the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. We are officially operating stolen technology." Richard stared at the paper. The words blurred together. Chrysalis Foundation. Revocation. Cease and desist. The laughter that had echoed in the room just 14 minutes ago was completely gone. The silence that replaced it was deafening, broken only by the incessant, mocking rings of the 12 phone lines from the angriest, most powerful financial institutions in the world. "Our stock," Thomas whispered in the background. Richard slowly looked up at the financial ticker running across the top of his screens. The Ethereus symbol, ATHR, which had been trading at a robust $214 a share just moments ago, was dropping with terrifying speed. Word of the global outage was already hitting the financial news networks. Algorithms, ironically similar to the ones Ethereus ran, were detecting the catastrophe and panic selling. $180, $145, $90. It was in free fall. Richard grabbed his phone, his fingers clumsy, and hit the speed dial for building security. "Downstairs. The lobby. Did Clara Kensington leave the building?" Yes, Mr. Sterling," the security guard replied, confused. "She walked out about 10 minutes ago." "Find her!" Richard screamed, spittle flying onto his mahogany desk. "Send men into the street. Bring her back here right now." "Sir, she's gone. She walked into the crowd." Richard threw the phone across the room. It shattered against the glass wall. His $30 billion empire, a fortress of wealth and power he thought was unassailable, was collapsing around him like a house of cards in a hurricane. And the architect of his destruction was a woman he had just laughed out of his office with, $42 in her pocket. Down in the coffee shop, Clara watched the financial news on the small TV above the counter. A red banner flashed across the bottom of the screen. Ethereus Holdings plummets 60% amid global trading outage. She took a slow sip of her black coffee. It tasted better than any expensive champagne she had ever had. The New York Stock Exchange has built-in fail-safes designed to prevent freefalls. They are called circuit breakers. If a stock drops too fast, trading is halted to allow the market to digest the panic. Ethereus Holdings hit its first circuit breaker exactly 18 minutes after Clara Kensington pressed a single key on her burner phone. Trading of ATHR was suspended at $87 a share. It was a catastrophic decapitation of a $30 billion valuation, playing out live on CNBC, Bloomberg, and Fox Business. Inside the Ethereus penthouse, the atmosphere had mutated from shocked silence to a screaming, feral panic. "Get Wachtel on the phone!" Richard Sterling bellowed, his voice hoarse, his Tom Ford suit jacket discarded on the floor. He was pacing the length of the boardroom like a caged animal. "I want the best litigators in the city in this room 20 minutes ago. Call Martin Lipton himself if you have to." Sarah Jenkins, the general counsel, was practically vibrating with anxiety. Her tablet was overflowing with urgent red-flagged emails. "Richard, Wachtel, Lipton, Rosen and Katz cannot fix this with a phone call. The SEC just contacted my office. The Securities and Exchange Commission is opening an emergency probe into our IPO disclosures. They are alleging we deliberately defrauded investors by claiming proprietary ownership of the Aegis base code. We didn't defraud anyone." Richard slammed his fist onto the oak table, fracturing the surface of his cracked crystal glass. "She slipped a poison pill into the architecture. That's corporate sabotage." "It's not sabotage if she owns the patent, Richard," Thomas Reynolds, the CFO, yelled back. It was the first time Thomas had ever raised his voice at him. The CFO's face was pale, slick with sweat. "I just got off the line with Morgan Stanley. Their automated clearinghouse failed to execute 300,000 trades in the last 20 minutes because our algorithm went dark. Do you know what the liability on that is? It's not millions, Richard. It's billions. We are personally liable for their latency losses. Bypass the lock, Richard said, stopping his pacing. He turned to Thomas, his eyes wide and unblinking. Get the engineering team to hack our own servers. Cut the chrysalis dependency out of the code. Recompile it, and get us back online. Thomas stared at him, horrified. Are you insane? You want me to authorize a cyber attack on a federally protected copyright to forcefully steal intellectual property? The DOJ would have the FBI raid this building by midnight. I'd go to federal prison for 20 years. If you don't get those servers online, there won't be a company left to raid, Richard screamed, advancing on the smaller man. Do it, Thomas. That is a direct order from the CEO. No. The word hung in the air, heavy and absolute. It didn't come from Thomas. Arthur Pendleton, the chairman of the board, had just walked through the double mahogany doors. He was a ruthless, 70-year-old titan of private equity, and he looked at Richard with the cold, detached expression of a butcher assessing a slab of meat. Trailing behind Arthur were 3 other board members and 2 men in severe grey suits who looked unmistakably like crisis management fixers. Arthur, Richard said, attempting to compose himself, smoothing down his silk tie. We are experiencing a temporary licensing dispute. A disgruntled former employee is attempting to extort us. I have the situation under. Shut up, Richard, Arthur said quietly. His voice didn't echo, but it commanded the room entirely. You don't have a damn thing under control. You let the architect of our primary revenue stream walk out the door, and in retaliation, she severed our spinal cord. I secured her NDA. She was demanding 20% of the company. I would have given her 40 if it kept the lights on, Arthur snapped, stepping into the room. He pointed a gnarled finger at the blackened server monitors on the wall. Do you understand what is happening out there? The Department of Justice is preparing to freeze Etheris's operating accounts, pending an investigation into wire fraud. The European Central Bank just issued a warning about systemic counterparty risk because your company handles 30% of their high-frequency debt routing. We can fight the injunction, Richard insisted, though his voice lacked its usual arrogant bass. We have the capital to bury her. We had the capital, Arthur corrected coldly. As of 3 minutes ago, the board held an emergency remote vote. You are hereby suspended as Chief Executive Officer, effective immediately. Your access to company funds is revoked. You are restricted to this floor until the federal regulators arrive. Richard physically recoiled, as if he had been struck. You can't do that. I built this company. I hold the majority voting shares. You hold 40%, Richard, Arthur replied, pulling a meticulously folded document from his inner pocket. And per the morality and gross negligence clauses in your founder's agreement, clauses I insisted upon, your voting rights are suspended in the event of an active SEC investigation into personal fraud. You lied to the board, Richard. You told us you had clean title to the IP. She hid it. It doesn't matter, Arthur said, turning away in disgust. He looked at Sarah. Where is Clara Kensington? We don't know, Sarah admitted, her voice trembling. She left the building at 4:05 p.m. Security lost her in Times Square. Find her, Arthur commanded. Hire Stratford Intelligence. Hire former Mossad if you have to. Find that woman and give her whatever she wants. Board seats, equity, a blank check. I want the Aegis algorithm back online before the Asian markets open, or we are all going to jail. Richard stood entirely alone at the head of the table. The sycophants who had laughed with him an hour ago now wouldn't even make eye contact. He looked down at his hands. They were shaking uncontrollably. He had stripped Clara of everything, left her with $42 and laughed. Now he was the one trapped in a glass box, stripped of his power, waiting for the authorities. The rain had stopped, leaving the New York streets slick and reflective under the amber glow of the streetlights. Clara Kensington walked calmly down a narrow, unassuming street in Brooklyn Heights. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. She knew exactly the kind of hellfire she had ignited across the river in Manhattan. She turned into a pre-war brownstone, bypassing the main lobby to descend a short flight of stairs to a basement-level office. The brass plaque on the door read, "Rosenthal and Vance, Legal Counsel." Wait, no, just Rosenthal and Associates. She pushed the door open. The office smelled of old paper, strong coffee, and stale cigar smoke. Behind a desk piled high with legal briefs sat Elias Rosenthal. He was a bulldog of a lawyer in his late 60s, with a rumpled suit and a brilliant, predatory mind. He had made his career destroying arrogant tech billionaires, and he had been waiting for Clara's call for 3 years. "Well," Elias said, looking up over his half-moon reading glasses. He pushed a steaming mug of tea across the desk toward an empty chair. "I see you finally pushed the button." Clara took off her damp coat and sat down, wrapping her cold hands around the mug. "He fired me, Elias. Offered me $50,000 and an NDA. Tried to freeze my personal checking accounts." Elias chuckled, a dry, raspy sound. Classic Richard Sterling, arrogance masking a fundamental lack of due diligence. He never bothered to read the Chrysalis Trust Charter, did he? "He thought it was just a tax shelter," Clara said, taking a sip of the tea. "He never realized it held the patent to the dynamic compression logic. The SEC will see that he claimed it as proprietary Ethereus assets on their S1 filing." "Oh, they already have," Elias said, turning his computer monitor toward her. "CNBC is having a field day. Sterling has been ousted by his board. The stock is down 72% in aftermarket trading. The DOJ has reportedly subpoenaed Ethereus's internal communications." Elias leaned back, interlacing his fingers. "So, the trap has sprung. The bear is caught in the snare. What do you want to do with him, Clara?" "I don't just want my company back, Elias," Clara said, her voice devoid of any warmth. "I want him to feel exactly what he tried to make me feel. I want him entirely broken." Elias nodded slowly. "Stratford Intelligence has been pinging your digital footprint for the last hour. They are trying to locate you. They want to settle. The board is desperate to get the servers back online before tomorrow's opening bell. They will offer you the moon." "Let them sweat," Clara replied. "Let the Asian markets open without the Aegis engine. Let the panic set in. By tomorrow morning, Ethereus Holdings will be facing so many breach of contract lawsuits from the Tier 1 banks that the company will be essentially insolvent. And then, Clara reached into her pocket, pulling out a small encrypted USB drive. She set it on the desk next to her tea. "We offer them a lifeline, but not to Ethereus, to the banks directly." Elias's eyebrows shot up. "You want to bypass Ethereus entirely?" "Richard built Ethereus as a middleman. He licensed my algorithm, hosted it on his servers, and charged the banks exorbitant fees for the routing. But the banks don't need Ethereus. They just need my code." Clara leaned forward, her eyes locked on Elias. "We are going to form a new entity tonight, Chrysalis Global. We will offer the megabanks direct, decentralized access to the Aegis engine. A direct lease. No middleman, no Richard Sterling." Elias stared at her, genuine awe dawning on his weathered face. "My God. If you do that, Ethereus isn't just crippled. It's obsolete. The banks will drop their contracts with Etheris immediately and sign with you. You'll gut Sterling's company from the inside out. And because Richard personally guaranteed the latency uptime to Goldman and Morgan Stanley, Clara continued, her voice cold as ice. When Etheris files for Chapter 11 bankruptcy tomorrow afternoon, the banks will go after his personal assets to recoup their losses. Elias let out a low whistle. They'll take his penthouse, his stock portfolio, his yachts. They'll liquidate him down to his shoelaces. He looked at the $42 in cash Clara had placed on the corner of his desk earlier. He left you with nothing. You're going to leave him with -$1 billion. Draft the contracts, Elias, Clara said, standing up. The exhaustion that had plagued her earlier was completely gone, replaced by the electric hum of pure adrenaline. I want the proposals sent to the CEOs of the 5 major banks by 3 a.m. Tell them the architect is open for business. Meanwhile, back in the glass cage of his penthouse office, Richard Sterling was experiencing a profound, suffocating terror. The crisis management team had confiscated his electronics. 2 federal agents were waiting in the lobby downstairs. His personal wealth, tied entirely to Etheris stock, was evaporating by the second. He stared out the rain-streaked window at the glittering city he thought he owned. He had laughed at her. He had called her weak. His private phone, the one line the fixers hadn't found yet, buzzed in his pocket. It was a text message from an unknown burner number. I kept the $42, Richard. You'll be needing it soon. See. The phone slipped from his trembling fingers, clattering onto the floor. The billionaire empire was gone. The nightmare was just beginning. The sun rose over Manhattan, casting a bruised purple light across the East River. It was 6 a.m. on a Tuesday, and the financial capital of the world was waking up to a slaughter. Inside the Etheris Holdings penthouse, the air was stale, smelling of cold sweat, burnt coffee, and impending ruin. Richard Sterling had not slept. His bespoke Tom Ford suit, once a symbol of his untouchable status, was now a wrinkled, discarded mess draped over a leather chair. His silk tie hung loose, his collar unbuttoned, and a rough shadow of silver stubble aged him 10 years in a single night. He sat at his cracked crystal desk, staring blankly at the wall of monitors. The blinking red lights had not stopped. If anything, they had multiplied. The Asian markets had opened hours ago. The Nikkei and the Hang Seng had experienced violent, unpredictable, algorithmic spasms because the Aegis engine, the hidden backbone of 30% of their high-frequency debt routing, was dead. To prevent a cascading global failure, foreign exchanges had manually severed all connections to Etheris servers. Arthur Pendleton, the chairman of the board, walked into the office. He looked as crisp and ruthless as he had the night before, though the dark circles under his eyes betrayed the marathon damage control sessions he had been running. Flanking him were 2 men in dark windbreakers bearing the bright yellow letters, FBI. Arthur, Richard croaked, his voice raw. He didn't even stand up. Tell me you got the injunction lifted. Tell me Wachtel found a loophole. Wachtel dropped us as a client at 4 a.m., Arthur said flatly, stopping a few feet from the desk. They cited a conflict of interest, but the truth is, they don't want the stench of this on their letterhead. It's over, Richard. It's not over, Richard hissed, slamming a fist onto the desk, though the gesture lacked any real power. I am still the largest shareholder. We file an emergency Chapter 11 reorganization. We freeze the bank contracts, restructure the debt, and drag Clara Kensington into discovery. We bleed her out with legal fees until she begs to reinstate the license. Arthur looked at him with a mixture of disgust and genuine pity. You really don't understand what happened overnight, do you? Arthur tossed a thick, freshly bound dossier onto Richard's desk. The cover bore the logo of Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, Barclays and Deutsche Bank, a consortium of the most powerful financial institutions on Earth. "Read it," Arthur commanded. Richard's trembling hands opened the folder. The legal jargon was dense, but the core message hit him like a physical blow to the chest. It was a formal notification of contract termination with extreme prejudice. But it wasn't just a cancellation. They're waiving the arbitration clause, Richard whispered, his eyes scanning the page frantically. They are demanding immediate restitution for latency losses. Arthur, this is a demand for $4 billion. Look at the next page, Arthur said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. Richard flipped the page. It was a press release, embargoed until 8 a.m., issued by a newly formed entity, Chrysalis Global. Chrysalis Global, under the direction of Chief Architect Clara Kensington, announces a direct, decentralized licensing partnership with the Tier 1 banking consortium. Effective immediately, the Aegis algorithm will bypass third-party hosting, providing dedicated, zero-latency cryptographic routing directly to partner institutions. She bypassed us, Richard gasped, all the air leaving his lungs. She went straight to the banks. She didn't just bypass us, Richard. She annihilated us, Arthur stated coldly. She offered them the exact same algorithm, running on faster, decentralized nodes for a fraction of the cost, because there is no middleman taking a massive cut. The bank signed at 3 a.m. Etheris has no product, no clients, and $4 billion in immediate unpayable liabilities. We are not filing for Chapter 11 reorganization, Richard. We are filing for Chapter 7 liquidation. The company is dead. Richard fell back into his chair, the room spinning. The $30 billion empire he had ruthlessly built, the fortress of glass and steel, had been completely hollowed out in less than 14 hours. Mr. Sterling, one of the FBI agents, stepped forward, his voice completely devoid of emotion. My name is Special Agent William Hastings. We have a federal warrant to seize all physical and digital assets on this premises. You are to step away from the computer and surrender any mobile devices. You can't do this, Richard stammered, his bravado finally breaking. I have a right to counsel. Your personal lawyers are waiting in the lobby, Agent Hastings replied. But before you go down there is an emergency board meeting scheduled in the main conference room in 10 minutes. Mr. Pendleton requested your presence. I suggest you attend. The main boardroom of Etheris Holdings, once the high-altitude temple where Richard Sterling decreed the fates of markets and men, had been thoroughly transformed into a mausoleum. The atmosphere was so heavy it felt physically difficult to breathe. The state-of-the-art air filtration system hummed quietly, trying and failing to scrub the sour smell of cold sweat, stale adrenaline, and impending legal doom from the room. Outside, the unrelenting Manhattan rain continued to batter the floor-to-ceiling windows, graying out the glittering city skyline that Richard used to look down upon like a conquering emperor. Around the 20-foot expanse of the polished oak table sat the remaining board members. They were a collection of apex predators of the financial world. Yet this morning, their faces were ashen, drawn tight with the horrifying realization that their immense wealth was currently vaporizing by the second. At the head of the table sat Arthur Pendleton. The 70-year-old chairman of the board looked exhausted, his usually immaculate posture slightly slumped, though his eyes remained as cold and unforgiving as flint. Let's make this quick, Arthur announced to the silent room, checking his heavy gold Patek Philippe watch. The New York Stock Exchange opens in exactly 40 minutes. Pre-market trading of ATHR is currently halted at $3.14 a share. The SEC is drafting the formal suspension order as we speak. Before anyone could respond to the grim statistics, the side door opened. Richard Sterling was escorted in by Special Agent William Hastings and a second, silent federal agent. Richard moved like a man walking underwater. He dragged his feet, his eyes bloodshot and darting frantically around the room, searching for a sympathetic face. He found none. The men and women who had eagerly drunk his expensive scotch and laughed at his jokes just yesterday now looked at him as if he were carrying a highly contagious disease. He was guided to a chair at the far end of the table, the absolute furthest point from the seat of power he had occupied for a decade. "Arthur," Richard began, his voice a raspy, desperate croak. "We need to file the emergency injunctions now. We can stall the SEC. I have a team of private litigators on retainer who can... We have one final item of business to conclude before the regulators officially lock the doors and seize the hard drives," Arthur interrupted, speaking over Richard as if the former CEO were nothing more than an irritating draught of wind. At that precise moment, the heavy mahogany double doors at the back of the boardroom swung open. Richard looked up, and his heart completely stopped in his chest. The remaining blood drained from his face, leaving him a sickly, translucent white. Clara Kensington walked into the room. She was no longer the exhausted, rain-soaked, trembling woman he had mercilessly mocked yesterday afternoon. The transformation was absolute. She wore a sharp, immaculately tailored charcoal suit that commanded the space. Her posture was rigidly perfect, her chin held high, and her dark eyes were sharp, calculating, and utterly devoid of mercy. Trailing just a half step behind her was Elias Rosenthal, the legendary litigator, clutching a slim, battered leather briefcase that looked wildly out of place in the sleek Billionaire's boardroom, yet felt infinitely more dangerous than any weapon. What is she doing here?" Richard snarled, a sudden, desperate surge of defensive anger temporarily masking his blinding terror. He shot out of his chair, pointing a trembling finger at Clara. "She is a corporate spy. She initiated a cyber attack on a multi-billion-dollar financial institution. Agent Hastings, arrest her right now." Agent Hastings didn't even blink. He placed a heavy, authoritative hand on Richard's shoulder and forced him back into his seat. "Miss Kensington is not under investigation, Mr. Sterling. She is here by right. She is acting as the appointed representative of the primary creditor consortium." Clara walked slowly down the length of the table. The rhythmic click-clack of her heels against the hardwood floor was the only sound in the cavernous room. She stopped exactly where Richard had sat the day before, the very spot where he had poured his 50-year-old scotch and celebrated her ruin. She looked down the length of the oak table at him, her expression eerily calm. "Good morning, Richard," Clara said softly. Her voice lacked the booming, theatrical arrogance he always favored, yet it carried an undeniable gravity that commanded absolute silence from everyone present. "You think you've won?" Richard spat, his hands gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles turned bone white. The veneer was cracking, revealing the panicked animal underneath. "You think destroying my company makes you a genius, but you breached your non-disclosure agreement. You breached fiduciary duty. I will spend the rest of my natural life tying you up in civil court. I will make sure you never write another line of code in this industry." Elias Rosenthal chuckled. It was a dry, raspy, deeply amused sound that echoed ominously in the tense room. He set his battered briefcase on the table and popped the brass latches. "Mr. Sterling, you seem to be operating under a severe, almost pathological misconception regarding your current legal and financial reality." Elias withdrew a single, perfectly crisp sheet of paper. He slid it across the polished oak table with the precision of a croupier dealing a fatal card. It glided over the wood and stopped precisely half an inch from Richard's white-knuckled hands. Richard stared at it as if it were a live grenade. "What is this?" he demanded, refusing to touch the paper. "That," Clara answered, leaning forward slightly, resting her fingertips on the table, "is a certified copy of the personal liability addendum. The one you signed 3 years ago when you secured the initial zero-latency guarantees with Morgan Stanley and Goldman Sachs." Richard's breath hitched. A cold sweat broke out across his forehead. He remembered the document. He had barely read it at the time. It was standard boilerplate, a bureaucratic formality for a system he believed was entirely infallible. He was the golden boy of Wall Street. Failure was a concept that applied only to other, lesser men. Since Etheris Holdings is currently insolvent and facing an immediate Chapter 7 liquidation, Elias explained, his tone conversational, almost cheerful, the $4 billion in damages demanded by the banks cannot possibly be paid by the corporate entity. Therefore, at 6 a.m. this morning, the consortium executed the personal guarantee clause. They are piercing the corporate veil, Mr. Sterling. They are coming directly for you. "They can't do that," Richard whispered, his voice cracking into a high-pitched wheeze. He looked wildly between Arthur and the FBI agents. "My personal assets are shielded. They are in offshore trusts in the Caymans. My real estate is held in blind holding companies. I am insulated." "Not anymore," Clara said, her voice dropping to a surgical, icy whisper. "When the Securities and Exchange Commission opened their criminal fraud investigation last night regarding your S1 IPO disclosures, it triggered a federal freeze on your entire global portfolio. The bank's legal teams, working in tandem with the Department of Justice, executed emergency liens across all your known and hidden accounts before the sun even came up." Clara placed her hands flat on the table, leaning in so that her words struck Richard with maximum, devastating impact. "Your $60 million penthouse in Tribeca is gone, Richard. The bank has already changed the biometric locks. Your numbered accounts in the Caymans have been seized and frozen by federal authorities under the Patriot Act. The mega yacht sitting in Monaco is currently being boarded by local port authorities under an international writ of attachment. The 40% stock you hold in this company is worth absolutely nothing. You are not just bankrupt, Richard. You are deeply, irrevocably, personally in debt to the most unforgiving, ruthless financial institutions on the planet." Richard stared at her, his mouth opening and closing silently, like a fish pulled onto dry land. The sheer, apocalyptic magnitude of the destruction was impossible for his brain to process. He had built an empire over a decade, clawing his way to the top of the financial food chain, and she had dismantled it down to the microscopic bedrock in under 24 hours. "Yesterday afternoon," Clara continued, her voice echoing slightly in the silent, paralyzed room, "you told me I had nothing. You looked at me and told me the world doesn't run on handshakes and genius. It runs on ink. You told me you held all the cards. You were right about the ink, Richard." She reached into the pocket of her tailored jacket and slowly pulled out a small wad of crumpled, damp bills. It was exactly $42. She tossed them onto the cracked surface of the table in front of him. They landed right on top of the personal liability addendum. "Consider this a severance package," Clara said, perfectly mirroring the cruel, mocking tone he had used the day before. "It's more than fair for a disgruntled, ousted, legally compromised employee. Take it and walk out of this building. If you don't, I will let Elias bury you in so much litigation that you won't even be able to afford a public defender by the time we are done." The silence in the boardroom was absolute and terrifying. Not a single board member moved a muscle. Even Arthur Pendleton, a man who had made a career out of corporate slaughter, looked visibly unnerved by the sheer precision of the woman standing at the head of the table. Richard slowly looked down at the $42. A single, ragged, pathetic sob tore from his throat. He covered his face with his trembling hands, the reality of his total annihilation finally crushing whatever ego remained. "Agent Hastings," Clara said, straightening her suit jacket and turning away from the broken man. "I believe Mr. Sterling is trespassing on corporate property. Please escort him off the premises immediately." "Stand up, Mr. Sterling," the FBI agent ordered, stepping forward and gripping Richard firmly by the arm. Richard was pulled to his feet. He didn't fight back. He didn't yell. He looked like a hollowed-out shell, a mere ghost of the billionaire who had laughed so cruelly just yesterday. As the agents marched him toward the heavy mahogany doors, his feet dragging on the imported Persian rug, he didn't look back. Clara watched the doors close behind him. The satisfying, heavy, echoing thud signaled the definitive end of an era. She turned to Elias, a genuine, albeit deeply exhausted smile finally touching her lips. "Elias," Clara said, her voice finally losing its icy edge, returning to the warm hum of the brilliant engineer she truly was. "Call the consortium. Tell them the Aegis engine is fully operational." At 9:30 a.m., the opening bell of the New York Stock Exchange echoed across the trading floor. Usually, it was a sound of immense energy and capitalist fervor. Today, it sounded like a gavel dropping on an execution block. Etheris Holdings, ticker symbol ATHR, didn't open. The designated market makers had completely abandoned the stock. By 9:45 a.m., the SEC officially suspended trading of Etheris shares indefinitely, citing catastrophic insolvency and ongoing federal fraud investigations. A $30 billion market cap was effectively vaporized in the span of a single coffee break. Down in the financial district, inside the heavily guarded, mahogany-lined executive suites of Goldman Sachs, the mood was paradoxically celebratory. The megabanks had weathered the storm. They had excised the parasitic middleman that was Richard Sterling and secured a direct pipeline to the Aegis algorithm through Clara Kensington's new entity, Chrysalis Global. William Taggart, a notoriously ruthless managing director at Goldman, sat at the head of a sprawling marble conference table. Around him were top executives from Morgan Stanley, Barclays and Chase. They were waiting for Clara. They expected a brilliant but naive engineer they could easily bully into an ironclad, exclusive 10-year contract that heavily favored the banks. At exactly 10 a.m., the heavy doors opened. Clara walked in, followed closely by Elias Rosenthal. She didn't look intimidated by the concentrated wealth and power in the room. She looked bored. "Clara, please sit down," William Taggart smiled, a predatory gleam in his eye. "First, let me congratulate you on a masterful tactical maneuver. Richard Sterling was becoming a massive liability for all of us. You did the market a favor by putting that rabid dog down. Now, let's discuss the integration of Chrysalis Global into our proprietary networks." He slid a sleek, leather-bound contract across the marble table. "We've drafted a localized exclusivity agreement. The consortium will pay Chrysalis $50 million a year in licensing fees. In exchange, you grant us exclusive administrative rights to the Aegis base code. You'll be a very wealthy woman, and we get the security of localized control." Clara didn't even look at the leather binder. She looked directly at William. "I think there has been a fundamental misunderstanding, William," Clara said softly, her voice carrying easily in the silent room. William's smile faltered. "Excuse me? You assume I destroyed Richard Sterling so I could take his place?" Clara continued, her tone conversational, but laced with steel. "You assume I want to be the new middleman, skimming $50 million a year to help you hyperinflate the market with zero-latency trading. Elias Rosenthal stepped forward, pulling a thin stack of papers from his briefcase. He handed one to each of the banking executives. "What is this?" A Morgan Stanley executive frowned, scanning the document. "That," Clara said, "is the new user agreement for the Chrysalis Foundation. Last night, I didn't just reroute the Aegis code to your servers. I restructured the core algorithm and transferred the entire intellectual property into an irrevocable, open-source trust." The color drained from William Taggart's face. "Open source? What are you talking about?" "The Aegis algorithm is no longer a proprietary weapon for Wall Street," Clara stated flatly. "As of midnight last night, the foundational code was published to the public domain under a strict, non-commercial regulatory license. Anyone can use it. Mid-level firms, retail trading platforms, academic institutions. The latency advantage you paid Richard billions to maintain is gone. I just leveled the entire global playing field." "You're insane!" William shouted, slamming his hand on the table, the illusion of the polite banker completely shattering. "We handle trillions of dollars. You can't just hand military-grade financial infrastructure to the public. We will sue you into the ground." "On what grounds?" Elias Rosenthal chuckled dryly. "You signed the temporary licensing agreement at 3 a.m. to save yourselves from total system failure. If you read Section 4, Paragraph B, you explicitly agreed to the open-source transition. If you breach that agreement, or attempt to monopolize the code, the Chrysalis kill switch activates again. Only this time it targets your specific nodes. I wouldn't recommend testing her, gentlemen. Ask Richard Sterling how that went." Clara stood up, buttoning her charcoal suit jacket. She looked around the room at the most powerful men in finance, all of them staring at her in stunned, impotent rage. "Richard laughed at me because he thought power was about hoarding resources," Clara said quietly. "He didn't understand that true power is the ability to change the rules of the game entirely. You have your servers back, gentlemen, but the monopoly is over. Good luck competing on actual merit." She turned and walked out of the room, leaving a deafening silence in her wake. The twist wasn't just that she took down a billionaire. The twist was that she dismantled the very system that created him. 50 blocks north, it was raining again. Richard Sterling stood on the corner of 5th Avenue and 59th Street. The federal agents had escorted him out of the Aetheris building with nothing but the clothes on his back. His phone was confiscated as evidence. His corporate black cards were deactivated. He was shivering, the cold rain soaking through his ruined Tom Ford suit. He stepped out into the street to hail a cab. A yellow taxi splashed through a puddle, soaking his expensive leather shoes, and sped right past him. He reached into his damp pocket to see if he had his emergency platinum card. His fingers brushed against something soft and crumpled. He pulled it out. It was $42 in cash. Richard stared at the wet, wrinkled bills in his hand. The crushing, suffocating reality of his situation finally breached his denial. He had no empire. He had no penthouse, no lawyers, no friends, and no power. The $30 billion were a phantom, a digital illusion built on a foundation he never actually owned. He was completely, utterly broke. He looked up at the towering glass skyscrapers of Manhattan, the city that had bowed to him just 24 hours ago. Now, it just looked cold, indifferent, and impossibly high. Richard Sterling, the god of Aetheris Holdings, slowly lowered his head, clutching the $42 as the rain washed away the last traces of his billionaire empire. The catastrophic collapse of Richard Sterling is a brutal masterclass in the dangers of unchecked corporate hubris. He confused legal maneuvering with true ownership, blinding himself to the reality that a towering skyscraper is entirely at the mercy of its unseen foundation. In his arrogance, he laughed at the architect who poured the concrete, believing a signature on an NDA was stronger than the dynamic code that literally kept his world spinning. Clara Kensington's revenge wasn't merely a financial takedown, it was a surgical dismantling of an ego. She weaponized his own greed against him, proving that true power doesn't reside in bespoke suits, glass penthouses, or billion-dollar valuations. It resides in the quiet, absolute leverage of the one who builds the system from the inside out. When the laughter faded, Richard learned the hardest lesson of Wall Street. Never underestimate the person holding the keys to the engine.